The pistol leveled at Ruby's chest trembled only slightly in Charles Whitmore's gloved hand.
So
The man in the
this is
tailored
where it all
coat
began,
barked something about
and where it
federal
must end.
rights, about land seizures and national interest, but the words scattered like dry leaves in the underground air. Ruby stood still as stone. The old wooden staff she held glowed faintly, light curling from its carvings like morning mist. Behind her, the luminous pool shimmered. Ancient power pulsed beneath her bare feet. "You don't understand," she said softly, voice steady and strange for a child. "This place isn't yours to take." Whitmore's mouth opened to reply, but then the mountain answered instead. 10 days earlier. The October wind clawed at the ridgeline like a beast denied entry. Clouds hung low, heavy with snow, and the scent of pine mixed with the faint, sweet smoke of last night's fire. Samuel Morrison, known as Bear to anyone west of St. Louis, stood at the edge of the clearing, his massive frame still, except for the flicker of his wool coat in the wind. The cabin looked like it was sinking into the mountain itself. It had no porch left, just sagging beams and a broken door barely holding on its hinges. Moss crept along the stone foundation, and half the roof was peeled away like the skin of a rotting apple. "This is it," Bear muttered. Behind him, an 8-year-old girl stood clutching a limp cloth doll. Ruby's green eyes scanned the ruin, calm but not sad. Her dress, a once pretty shade of blue, was flecked with road dust and pine needles. "It looks like it's been waiting," she whispered, "waiting for someone to come back." Bear glanced down at her, and for a moment, the ache in his chest overtook the cold in the air. She had Sarah's eyes, Sarah's quiet way of knowing too much. It had been 3 years since the fever took her, but sometimes Bear still caught himself reaching for a second tin mug when boiling coffee. He turned back to the cabin. "This place belonged to your grandfather," he said. "My father." "Never thought I'd see it again." Ruby wrinkled her nose. "Is this the one your brothers made fun of?" Bear snorted. "They called it Lot 47, Section 12. Said it was worth less than a sack of potatoes. A fool's inheritance, Edmund wrote." "A joke. But we're still here," she said. Bear nodded. They spent that day clearing out the worst of the mess. Bear patched the roof with pine planks while Ruby swept rat nests from the hearth. The structure was better than it looked. Tight joinery under the rot, solid beams beneath the dust. Someone had built this place to last. At sunset, Bear lit a fire. The chimney worked like it had just been cleaned. They ate cornbread and beans on a wool blanket Bear found in a trunk. Ruby leaned against his arm, watching the fire. "Why'd your family send you this?" she asked. Bear stared into the flames for a long time. "Because they thought it would drive me back," he said finally. "Make me beg for my place in the family business again." "They think a cabin like this breaks a man," Ruby tilted her head. "It looks like a place that holds things together." Outside, the wind howled again. Bear pulled a worn pocket watch from his vest, his grandfather's, still ticking. The firelight glinted on the cracked glass. Then Ruby stirred. "There's something carved into the wall." She knelt near a load-bearing beam, brushing dust away with her sleeve. Symbols appeared, fine and deliberate, circles within mountains, lines like rivers, etched so faintly they'd almost disappeared. Bear joined her, ran his fingers across the grooves. "Don't look like anything from our alphabet." "Do you think Grandpa put it here?" Bear shrugged. "Maybe. Or someone before him." Ruby pressed her ear to the beam. "Feels like it's humming." Bear gave a quiet laugh. "You always say things like that." "I always hear things like that." Later, as she slept rolled in the old blanket, Bear sat alone beside the fire. He stared at the wall where the symbols faded into shadow. He had left this world behind once, chose Sarah, chose the wild over inheritance. But somehow it had found him again, and it wasn't done with him. 3 days passed. They uncovered more symbols on floorboards, under a drawer, on the stone hearth. Ruby found a loose tile beneath the bunk. Beneath it, a leather-wrapped stone, smooth and dark, etched with the same markings. The thing was warm to the touch. Bear didn't sleep that night. He turned the stone over in his hands until the fire burned low and the wind stopped howling. Then, on the 4th day, Bear was chopping pine for shingles when Ruby shouted from the clearing, "Riders, Papa!" Coming down the east ridge, he dropped the axe and strode toward her. 3 men on horseback emerged from the trees, dressed like city folk long coats, pressed trousers, bowler hats. One of them waved, a hand in a leather glove. Bear rested a hand on the axe. The lead man dismounted. "Mr. Morrison, I presume." "You are?" "Charles Whitmore." Representing a group of interested investors from Cheyenne Bear didn't answer. "This land beautiful but remote, hard to maintain. Our clients would like to relieve you of the burden. $500, cash. For the property, the structure, and rights thereto." Bear raised an eyebrow. "That's nearly 3 times what my brother said it was worth." Whitmore smiled with no warmth. "Value is relative, Mr. Morrison." The other 2 riders flanked the cabin, eyes cataloging, lips tight. Bear studied them. The way they moved, too clean for real work, too alert for just businessmen. He took a step forward. The leather of his boots creaked in the dirt. "We just got here," he said. "Ain't selling." Whitmore's jaw twitched, but his smile remained. "Of course. Think on it. We'll return in 3 days." He swung back into the saddle. The riders turned, trotting down the ridge without another word. Bear watched them go, heart thudding. "Who were they?" Ruby asked behind him. He didn't answer, just looked down at the medallion in his pocket, now pulsing with subtle warmth. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing. Whatever they thought was here, it was worth far more than $500, and somebody was willing to lie, spy, and threaten to get it. 10 minutes later, Bear returned to the cabin. He closed the door, bolted it, and pulled a worn journal from his pack, a place marked by family, a girl without a mother, and a man who'd walked away from everything. It was time to find out what his father had really left behind, because the mountain was whispering again. And the last time Bear ignored the whispers of the land, he lost everything. This time he was listening. Family mocked the giant cowboy and his daughter for a cabin until they discovered this secret. The morning after Whitmore and his men rode off, the mountain air felt different, still, expectant. Samuel Bear Morrison stood on the front steps of the old cabin, hands resting on the handle of his axe. His broad shoulders were tense, his jaw tight with the kind of quiet fury that didn't burn, hot it smoldered. Low and patient. He didn't like the way Whitmore had smiled when he said they'd be back. Didn't like the way those 2 hired suits circled the property like they were casing a bank. And he sure as hell didn't like that their offer had come before they'd even known his name. They weren't buyers, they were scavengers. And the mountain knew it. Inside the cabin, Ruby knelt by the hearth, humming to herself as she rearranged her doll's little cloth bed. Sunlight spilled through the broken window panes, catching on the dust in the air like 1,000 tiny stars. She looked up as Bear came in. "Papa," she said, "the wall's warm." Bear raised an eyebrow. "Warm?" She pointed to the stones near the fireplace. "Right here. It's humming." He walked over and pressed his palm against the rock. At first he felt nothing, but then, just beneath the surface, like a heartbeat through stone, a faint thrum. He stepped back. "What in God's name?" Ruby was already tugging at a loose panel near the base. With the curiosity only children dare to act on, she wriggled her fingers into a narrow gap. Dust fell like flour. The panel shifted. With a soft pop, a hidden compartment swung open. Inside sat a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. Ruby reached for it, but Bear caught her hand gently. "Let me." He lifted it out carefully. The bundle was heavier than expected. Wrapped inside was a dark, palm-sized, stone smooth as river rock, cold as shadow. Symbols were carved deep into its surface, fine and deliberate, glowing faintly as the light touched them. Bear didn't recognize the script. It didn't look like English, or Latin, or any alphabet he'd ever seen. Ruby stared. "It's singing." He turned to her, startled. "What?" She blinked. "I can't hear it with my ears." "But I feel it." Here she pressed her little hand over her heart. Bear looked back at the stone. Later that day, he packed the stone into a tin box and saddled his horse. Ruby clung to his leg. "Where are you going?" "Town. Need answers." She frowned. "About the stone?" "About a lot of things." He paused, then knelt beside her. "I'm leaving you with Mrs. Henderson." "Just for a bit. Can I bring my doll?" He smiled, brushing hair from her face. "Of course." Bear Falls was a hardscrabble town built around a rail spur and a few old hopes. Its storefronts leaned like tired men on a bar stool, and the mud from last week's rain still clung to wagon wheels and boots alike. Bear headed for the general store first, climbed the creaky stairs to the loft above it where Professor Elijah Adams kept a small library and an even smaller office. Adams, a reedy man with round spectacles and a voice like parchment, looked up from a ledger as Bear stepped in. "Well, look what the wind dragged down from the mountain." Samuel Morrison, back in town and not bleeding. "That's new. Morning, Professor." Adams squinted. "You brought something, didn't you?" Bear pulled the tin box from his coat, unwrapped the deerskin. Adams went very still. The stone's symbols caught the lamplight. "Well," he breathed, "that's remarkable. You recognize it?" "I don't know if I do, but I know what it isn't." He stood and opened a drawer filled with old papers, maps, and books that smelled of dust and ink. He pulled out a worn field guide sacred markings of the Western tribes. "Do you see these?" he said, pointing to a page filled with petroglyph sketches. "These circles, the lines radiating out, similar style. Lakota. Maybe older. Could be pre-contact." Bear watched, arms crossed. Adams kept flipping pages. Some tribes believed certain bloodlines were chosen as guardians. Keepers of sites the earth itself held sacred. Places of power. And this is, what? A map? Maybe. Or a key to what? Adams shut the book gently. "You'd need someone closer to the source, a tribal elder, a spiritual keeper." "No one." Adams nodded slowly. "Joseph Standing Bear. Lakota. Lives north of here, off the main trails. Doesn't talk to many, but he knows the old ways. If anyone can read that stone, it's him." Bear repacked the stone. "I'll find him." Adams touched his arm before he could turn. "Samuel, be careful. That thing you're holding. People would kill for less." Bear's eyes darkened. "I've got more to protect than myself." It took 2 days on horseback to find the old man. Joseph Standing Bear lived in a hand-built lodge tucked between 2 ridges, where the wind moved like it was remembering something. The smell of burning sage and pine hung in the air. He saw Bear coming before Bear even dismounted. "You are the son of Jeremiah," he said. "I see your father in your shoulders." "You knew him?" "We shared responsibility." Bear followed him inside. The lodge was quiet, circular, warm. Smoke rose from a central pit, curling toward a small opening in the roof. Baskets lined the walls, bones and feathers, bundles of herbs. Bear placed the stone on a fur mat between them. Joseph touched it reverently. "I remember this. You've seen it before. Your grandfather brought it here." many winters ago, told me your blood carried a thread, a duty. When the mountain called again, it would pass to the one who answered. I didn't come looking for duty. No, but duty found you. Joseph stood and reached for a deer-hide bundle, unwrapped it, a map, drawn by hand. Lines of peaks, symbols for water, hidden places. Bear saw the pattern, the cabin, the clearing, a series of curved lines leading inward like roots beneath the soil. This is the mountain's heart, Joseph said. Your land sits atop it. The stone will show the path. When the time is right, and what happens if someone tries to take it? Joseph's face grew grave. They awaken things they do not understand. The mountain remembers. It defends itself. Outside, the wind shifted. Leaves rustled like whispers. Bear left at dusk. The trail back was darker than he remembered, but he didn't mind. The stone felt warmer now, as if recognizing its next keeper. The stars blinked awake. By the time he arrived at the Hendersons' ranch, Ruby was already asleep on the porch swing, curled with her doll. Bear gathered her into his arms. She stirred. Did the stone say anything? She asked, eyes still closed. Not with words, Bear said. She nestled against his chest. I dreamed it was singing. He paused. What did it sound like? Not music, like... Memory Bear looked up at the night sky, and in the silence he thought he almost heard it too. Family mocked the giant cowboy and his daughter for a cabin until they discovered this secret. The storm came without warning. By late afternoon, the clouds had crept over the ridge like wolves closing in. Snow started to fall hard, dry and wind-whipped, tapping against the cabin windows like impatient fingers. Inside, the fire snapped and popped, throwing long shadows across the rough plank floor. Bear had spent the morning reinforcing the roof and sealing the broken window with salvaged glass. Ruby had kept herself busy arranging wildflowers in an old tin mug and reading through one of the books they found in a chest, something about mineral patterns and fault lines. But now, with the wind howling through the eaves and the mountain wrapped in white, there was nothing to do but wait. He sat in front of the fire, rolling the dark stone between his fingers. The carved symbols shimmered faintly, even without light. That soft pulse it hadn't stopped since he found it. It wasn't just warm anymore. It felt aware. He rose and stepped closer to the fireplace. The structure was wide and deep, built of solid stone. He had studied it before. But tonight, something tugged at his mind, a pattern he hadn't seen before. He crouched and ran his fingers along the stones near the hearth's base. One in particular caught his eye. It bore a single carved mark, almost identical to the center glyph on the medallion. Bear hesitated, then pressed the stone against the carving. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he felt a shift beneath his hand, a faint click. The stone sank inward, and the entire lower portion of the hearth slid forward with a groan of ancient hinges. Cold air rushed from the darkness beyond. "Ruby," he called out. She was already behind him. Her eyes were wide. "Is that a door?" He nodded, pulling a lantern from the hook by the stove. The flame flickered as he stepped into the hidden chamber. It wasn't large, maybe 8 feet square, but dry and solid. The walls were lined with stone shelves, most empty. But one corner held a wooden crate sealed with a leather strap. A bundle of cloth sat atop it. Bear knelt and unwrapped the bundle. Inside, a leather-bound journal, worn but intact. Across the front, stamped in faded gold, Jeremiah Morrison. He opened it. The writing was dense, neat, with long, sweeping loops. He recognized the hand immediately, his father's. He flipped to the first page. June 15th, 1864. Father died today. His last words were about the sacred trust. I thought it was fevered rambling, until Marcus came to the funeral. Bear turned the page slowly, the weight of each word settling in his bones. The Lakota call it the heart of the world, a convergence of forces beneath the earth. Some say it's geological, others say spiritual. I only know I was chosen, not because I'm strong, but because our line carries something others don't. July 3rd, 1864. Explored the cave system, found symbols matching the stone medallion. Marcus says we are not owners, we are stewards. I didn't believe him. Then I touched the pool. Bear paused, looked at Ruby, who was kneeling beside him now, her small hands resting on the edge of the crate. He turned another page. August 12th, 1867. Peaton Mining Consortium visited again. Claimed survey rights. I turned them away. But they'll return. They smell what lies beneath like wolves scenting blood. September 30th, 1869. Samuel left today. He doesn't understand. I couldn't tell him. Not yet. He would think me mad. Better he hate me than risk the secret. The mountain must choose him, not me. The breath caught in Bear's throat. He had been 22. Walked out after a final fight about Sarah, about marrying for love, not legacy. His father had slammed the door behind him, said the Morrison name was meant for more than mountains and dirt. Bear had never come back. Not until now. He turned to the final entries. May 15th, 1887. My health fails. I see visions. A child with green eyes walking among light. The guardians speak. The next keeper is coming. Samuel must return. May 30th, 1887. The inheritance is arranged. Samuel will get the land, but not the truth. He must earn that himself. Only the chosen can open the hidden place. June 2nd, 1887. The Peaton men grow bolder. They whisper of federal contracts, legal documents, eminent domain. But they do not understand the mountain does not answer to law. The mountain remembers. The mountain chooses. Bear closed the journal. The silence in the chamber felt different now, sacred. He looked around again and noticed a smaller box beneath the shelves. It was cedar, hand-carved with a brass clasp. Inside was a ring plain gold, worn by time, his mother's wedding band. Next to it, folded with care, was a hand-drawn map. The same ridges and valleys he knew from his hikes, but marked in red were symbols he recognized from the medallion, leading to something deep in the mountain's spine. "Papa," Ruby whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "What does it mean?" He didn't answer at first, then, quietly, "It means your grandfather wasn't crazy. He was right. About all of it." They emerged from the chamber and resealed the hearth. Snow still fell outside, softer now. The fire crackled. Bear sat back down and stared into the flames, the journal in his lap. He thought about the kind of man who would bury his life's truth behind stone. Not to hoard it, but to protect it. And he wondered just how much of that man still lived inside him. Ruby crawled into his lap. She carried something he hadn't seen before, a long wooden staff, carved from aged oak. She must have found it in the crate. It was wrapped in leather, etched with symbols matching the medallion. When she touched it, the carvings shimmered with the faintest silver light. It was standing in the corner, she said, like it was waiting. Bear stared at the staff, then at his daughter. He hadn't been ready before, but maybe she was. Maybe the mountain had already chosen. Family mocked the giant cowboy and his daughter for a cabin until they discovered this secret. It began with a knock that didn't belong in the mountains. Sharp, measured, civilized. Bear paused in the middle of sharpening his hunting knife. He could count on one hand the people who'd ever knocked on that door, let alone with such precise confidence. He opened it slow, hand hovering near the revolver tucked into the back of his waistband. Charles Whitmore stood framed in the late morning light, dressed in another of his tailored coats, black gloves, hat tilted forward. His eyes, cold and gray, flicked across Bear's face with a practiced calm. Behind him stood a fourth man Bear hadn't seen before, a clean-shaven fellow with ink-stained fingers and a briefcase polished like a mirror. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Whitmore said. "I trust the weather's been agreeable." Bear didn't answer. Whitmore smiled, unfazed. "We brought our counsel this time. Mr. Dunley specializes in property law." The man stepped forward and tipped his hat. "Mr. Morrison, if I might have a word—" Bear stepped out, forcing both men a pace backward. He filled the doorway like a shadow made of bone and leather. "You've got one," Dunley cleared his throat. "We have legal claim to all mineral rights beneath these 34 acres. Your family deeded that over 2 generations ago in exchange for a preferred investor's seat in the Piton Mining Corporation." Bear's jaw flexed. "Show me." Dunley opened the briefcase and produced a folder. Thick, official, pages of signatures and embossed seals. Bear took it with rough hands and flipped through. At the bottom of one page, written in neat, familiar cursive, was a signature he hadn't seen in 20 years. Edmund H. Morrison. He stared at the name, the ink like a bruise. "You tell me my brother signed away my land?" Whitmore spoke now, voice syrupy. "Not quite. Your father held those shares in joint family trust. When he passed, your brother took executorship, quite legal, quite binding. He had no right. The law disagrees." Bear didn't speak. His silence was heavy, dangerous. "Of course," Whitmore continued, "we'd still prefer to resolve this amicably. Sell us your surface rights. We'll compensate you handsomely. $5,000. More than fair." Bear didn't blink. "You boys came here to rob me." And brought paperwork instead of pistols. Dunley shut the briefcase a little too quickly. "Mr. Morrison, this isn't personal." "That's the problem," Bear growled. "Maybe it should be." Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "We'll give you a few days to consider. Winter's coming. No reason to spend it in court." They turned and walked back to their horses. Ruby stood on the porch as Bear came inside. She looked small next to him, arms wrapped around that same cloth doll. Who were they? Men who think money is the same thing as truth. That night, Bear lit every lantern in the cabin and spread out the map from Jeremiah's journal. Ruby sat nearby with the wooden staff across her lap. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. The symbols lined up with the valleys, the old mine shaft, even the ridge they'd camped beneath years ago. It wasn't just a cave network. It was a living artery beneath the land. Energy, power, memory. Bear pressed his thumb against the red circle etched deepest on the map. They want this. He looked again at the contract. One paragraph jumped out now like a snake from the dark. In the event of dispute, Piton Mining reserves the right to explore, extract, or enforce claims under federal mining statutes pending adjudication. They didn't just want the land. They meant to take it. 2 days later, as Bear rode into town to track down county records, he saw a familiar figure step off the coach outside the post office. Tall, silver hair swept back, city-cut coat tailored sharp, eyes like cold steel set in a face that used to look like his own, Edmund Morrison. He spotted Bear immediately and gave that same tight, elegant smile he'd used since they were boys when he was hiding something. "Sam," he said, stepping forward like a man expecting a handshake. Bear didn't move. "I was hoping we could talk." Bear stared. Edmund cleared his throat. "Privately." They found a quiet table in the back of the saloon. Bear didn't order anything. Edmund did. Whiskey. Neat. "I thought you were in Philadelphia," Bear said finally. "I was, until Whitmore called." Bear's eyes narrowed. "He works for you." Edmund hesitated. "He works with me. I'm on the board now. Piton needed capital. I saw potential. You know how Father always said we needed something stable? You mean profitable?" "Same difference." Bear leaned forward. Did you know what was under that land when you sent me the deed? Edmund swirled his glass. Let's not pretend I could have dragged you back any other way. Bear's hands clenched under the table. I gave you a chance, Sam. You walked away. From the company, from the family, from everything. I walked away from you. Edmund's smile faded. I told them you'd resist, that you were still too proud. But they'll push, Sam. They'll use every page in the book. And if that doesn't work, they'll flip to pages that were never printed. Bear's voice dropped. You threaten me? I'm warning you. What do you want? Edmund looked up, and for the first time, Bear saw something crack behind his eyes. I want this done before it gets dirty. Sell your part. Walk away. Let me handle the rest. Bear stood. I'm not walking away from Ruby. Or this land. Not again. Edmund looked up slowly. You really don't get it, do you? They don't want you. They want her. She's the one the mountain chose. They know it. They've seen what she can do. Bear's blood ran cold. Edmund saw it and leaned back, victorious. Walk away, Sam. Or they'll take her. For a moment, Bear couldn't breathe. Then he turned and walked out, not looking back. Outside, snow had started to fall again, soft and quiet, the kind that blanketed things before they broke. In the saddle, Bear whispered into the wind, let them come. Let them try, because now he knew the truth, and the truth had teeth. Family mocked the giant cowboy and his daughter for a cabin until they discovered this secret. Bear didn't sleep much that night. His hands kept drifting toward the rifle beside the bed, even though the cabin was quiet. He kept thinking of Edmund's words of what Peaton would do if they couldn't get the land through signatures. They would come for Ruby. He watched her sleep under the patchwork quilt, the carved staff clutched tight in her arms. A strange calm had settled over her. She hadn't spoken much after he returned from town, just sat by the fire, humming softly, staring at the glowing medallion. She wasn't scared, but Bear was. By dawn, he was already riding north. Joseph Standing Bear was waiting for him. I knew you'd come back, the old man said, not looking up from the herbs he was grinding in a bowl. The mountain always brings its own home. Bear didn't waste time. They're coming, Joseph nodded. And you are not ready. I need help. Joseph turned toward the back of the lodge and called out in Lakota. A younger man appeared from behind a curtain, lean and sharp-eyed, with a face that carried both defiance and kindness in equal measure. This is my grandson, Michael. He served in the army, knows both our ways and theirs. He'll go with you. Bear looked the man over. Michael stepped forward and offered a quiet, firm nod. I've seen what companies like Peaton do. I won't let them dig up the bones of my people. They packed quickly ropes, lanterns, herbs, maps, and the bone-carved compass Joseph had kept locked in a cedar box. It wasn't like any compass Bear had seen. The needle didn't point north. It spun, slow and deliberate, until it stopped and pulsed faintly toward the mountains. That doesn't point to metal, Michael said as they mounted their horses. It points to memory. The trail to the hidden cave wasn't marked, but Ruby knew it anyway. She walked beside Bear and Michael as they moved deeper into the pine woods. Snow clung to the branches overhead, and silence pressed in like a second skin. But Ruby walked as if she'd done it before. This way, she said, pointing to a break in the stone wall. The light singing louder now. They followed her down into a narrow ravine, through brush and under rock ledges, until the entrance revealed itself, a natural crevice, partly hidden behind a fall of frozen moss. Inside was darkness. And then, light. As Bear lifted his lantern, the walls shimmered, not from the flame but from something within the stone itself. Lines of silver blue flowed like veins, casting a glow that deepened with every step. The air was cool and humming, and the earth beneath their boots felt soft, almost alive. Michael murmured a prayer under his breath. They moved deeper, down tunnels carved not by pickaxe, but by time. Stalactites glittered like glass above their heads. Ruby's staff glowed now, casting a faint halo around her as she led them down a side path Bear never would have noticed. At the end of that path, the chamber opened wide, and what they saw took Bear's breath. A lake, not of water, but something thicker, glowing softly like moonlight captured in liquid. The surface was still, glass smooth, and gave off no heat, yet filled the air with warmth. This was the heart of the world. This is what they're after, Bear said, voice quiet. Michael nodded. They think they can bottle it, sell it, control it. They can't. They'll try anyway. Bear knelt at the edge of the glowing lake. The medallion in his pocket vibrated slightly. When he held it out, it shimmered in rhythm with the surface. Behind him, Ruby walked to a stone platform at the center of the chamber. It rose from the earth like an altar, carved with symbols identical to those in Jeremiah's journal. "This is the place from my dreams," she whispered. Bear turned sharply. "You dreamed of this?" She nodded. "It called me here." Michael knelt beside the platform. "This is where the Guardian used to stand." The one chosen to listen, to protect Ruby, laid the staff across the altar. The stone beneath it pulsed once, then again. A soft sound filled the chamber like wind through 1,000 pine trees, or water over distant rocks. It wasn't music, but it wasn't silence either. "She can hear it," Michael said. Bear swallowed. "Why her?" "Because she was born into it, and because she's not afraid." The medallion in Bear's hand twisted slightly, as if tugged. He looked down and noticed the compass in Michael's hand was glowing too. The needle pointed not to the lake, but to a shadowed alcove near the far wall. They crossed the chamber slowly. The rock face was smooth, untouched, until Ruby reached out and pressed her palm against it. Symbols flared beneath her hand. A line formed across the stone, and with a low rumble, a seam appeared, then split. A doorway opened. Behind it, another passage, narrower, darker, but warmer. Michael lit another lantern. "That's the true heart, the inner sanctum." Where the energy is strongest, Bear turned to Ruby. She stared at the path ahead, eyes wide, but not with fear. "Do you want to go in?" he asked. She looked up at him. "It's not that I want to. It's that I have to." Bear looked to Michael, who nodded once. "You'll need to go soon. Before they get here. Before they seal it forever." Bear stared into the darkness beyond the open gate. He didn't know what lay inside, but he knew now that Ruby was more than just his daughter. She was the mountain's last chosen, the final guardian, and if Piton got past them, they wouldn't just lose the land, they'd lose the memory of it. Behind them, the stone door remained open, pulsing like a heartbeat waiting to be followed. Family mocked the giant cowboy and his daughter for a cabin until they discovered this secret. Bear stood in the early morning mist, hammer in one hand, rifle in the other, and looked at the cabin not as a home, but as a last stand. He had spent the entire night reinforcing every window, bracing every beam, rerouting the front path with false trail signs and snow-covered brush. He hid traps under fallen leaves and packed gunpowder kegs behind the chicken coop. The door frames were reinforced with iron rods he'd found rusting beneath the barn, and the walls, those old pine logs, now held bullets and salt rounds tucked into the seams. Inside, the kitchen table had been cleared to make room for maps, ledgers, and empty brass casings. Ammo was being loaded by hand. Food rations were stacked neatly beside a set of canteens. Every step had a purpose now. Michael worked silently beside him, sharpening knives and tying off bundles of sage. Every so often he'd glance out the window toward the tree line. "They'll come from the south," he finally said. "Less rock to blast through." Bear nodded. "That's where the slope's softest." Behind them, Ruby was at the fireplace again, staring into the embers. The staff rested across her lap. Her green eyes looked distant-focused on something neither man could see. "They're not far now," she said quietly. Bear turned. "You mean Whitmore?" She shook her head. "No, the others, Guardians. They're waking up. They're coming home." Michael leaned forward. "You mean more like you?" "More like us," she said. "Different people." Same promise. It started that same afternoon. A rider appeared just before dusk, an older woman wearing a battered cavalry coat, feathers braided into silver hair. She introduced herself as Clara Keene, granddaughter of the guardian of Devil's Gate Pass. Then came two brothers from Idaho, dark-skinned and quiet-spoken, who carried axes and old journals passed down through 5 generations. A Mexican family from Arizona arrived next, their wagon piled with blankets, tools, and a map stitched into leather. By nightfall, the hill around the cabin had turned into a camp. Fires burned low, smoke curling into the star-pinned sky. Children ran barefoot through the snow. Elders sang songs Bear didn't recognize, but Ruby somehow did, humming along under her breath, like she'd known them all her life. One woman from the Dakota Plains had silver powder painted across her cheekbones. Another bore a tattoo across her chest in the shape of a flame. Every one of them came with the same look in their eyes, a kind of quiet readiness. No fear, only memory. Joseph arrived last, walking with a carved cane and a heavy pouch of herbs tied to his belt. "It's been a long time since they gathered like this," he said to Bear as they stood near the main fire. "Will it be enough?" Bear asked. Joseph looked out across the faces glowing in firelight. "If it's not, then nothing ever was." Ruby stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the flames. She raised the medallion above her head, and it pulsed silver brighter than Bear had ever seen. The other guardians fell quiet. Some knelt. Others placed their hands over their hearts. "She is the sign," Clara Keene whispered, "just like the prophecy said." The last one, the Link Michael, stepped beside her. "The mountain speaks through her now." And then, in the stillness, Ruby turned toward Bear. "They know we're ready," she said. "How?" She pointed toward the dark ridge across the valley. "There," she whispered. A string of lights flared on the far side of the mountain, bright beams, mechanical and cold, sweeping the trees like eyes. A machine's groan followed, metal scraping against rock, the whine of engines and the thunder of drills echoing off the stone. "They brought the rig," Michael said grimly, "the one they used near the Badlands." Bear's face hardened. "They're not here to argue anymore. They're here to take." In the morning light, the cabin looked different. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a fortress built from memory and grit, a place that stood because someone refused to let it fall. Bear stood on the porch, looking toward the ridge. He could see Whitmore's men now trucks crawling like beetles across the frozen trail, smoke rising from their engines. They weren't hiding anymore. They didn't need to. Behind them, a drilling tower was being hauled piece by piece through the pines, its arms folded like a vulture's wings, steel teeth gleaming. Whitmore stepped out from one of the coaches, adjusted his gloves, and stared up at the cabin. He lifted a megaphone, and his voice cut through the valley. "This is your final warning. Evacuate by sunrise, or we start drilling through that mountain." Bear didn't answer. He just stepped back into the doorway, set down his rifle, and picked up the staff. The guardians behind him rose in silence, because the mountain didn't belong to paper, and neither did they. Family mocked the giant cowboy and his daughter for a cabin until they discovered this secret. The wind came hard off the ridge that morning, curling over the pine trees like a warning. Bear was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the hooves. Not many. Just one horse coming steady, unhurried like someone who knew their way and wasn't afraid of where it led. He straightened slowly and turned toward the path. The rider came into view around the bend, a man in his late 40s, leaner than Bear but built of the same bones. He wore a dusty trail coat and a plain brown hat. On his saddle horn hung a rolled blanket and a canteen. Across his chest, a leather strap holding a small wooden box, dark with age. Thomas Morrison, youngest of the Morrison brothers, gone for 20 years. He slowed the horse just short of the gate, pulled off his hat, and looked up at Bear like time hadn't passed at all. "You gonna shoot me?" he said, "or let me get a word in?" Bear didn't answer right away. Then he stepped aside. Thomas dismounted, stretched his legs, and let the horse graze. He looked around at the fortified cabin, the campfires beyond it, the distant line of guardians moving in quiet preparation. "Well," he said softly, "looks like I got here just in time." Bear folded his arms. "Where the hell have you been?" "South, Texas, then the border. Worked horses, freight lines, even wrangled a bit. Didn't reckon you'd want to see me." "You reckoned right." Thomas sighed, then opened the wooden box and took out something small, wrapped in red cloth. He held it out carefully, unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a ring. Old, simple. But carved on the band in weathered silver was the Morrison family mark, a tree, rooted deep with branches wrapped around a mountain. "I found this in Father's desk," Thomas said, "buried under the old Union Bible. You know the one Bear did, the one they weren't allowed to touch growing up. There was a letter with it," Thomas continued, reaching into the box again, "written before he died." He handed the paper over. Bear took it, unfolding it slowly. The ink was faded, but their father's handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, upright, no wasted curves. "To the one who chooses to return, the land is not owned. It is borrowed. The true guardian is not the one with the biggest name or the deepest pockets. It is the one willing to bleed for what cannot be bought." Bear's throat tightened. "He left it for all of us," Thomas said, "but I think he knew only one of us would come back." Bear looked up. Thomas met his gaze. "I'm not here to steal, or sell, or side with Edmund. I came because I couldn't keep pretending none of this mattered." Inside the cabin, Ruby stood quietly in the doorway, listening. Her staff leaned against the doorframe. She looked at Thomas with curious, cautious eyes. "You're his brother?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "That's right, little one. You must be Ruby." She looked him over for a long beat. Then, slowly, she smiled, and just as quickly, her smile dropped. "They're in the mountain," she whispered. Bear's head snapped toward her. "Where?" "I don't know how," she said, "but I can feel it." They didn't come down the ridge. They came from underneath. Michael burst through the side door, panting, rifle in hand. "We just found a blast mark near the old mining shaft. South slope." They opened a tunnel from the canyon side. "They're already in." Bear grabbed his coat. "Where's the closest entrance?" Michael pointed toward the trail behind the cabin. "The Deer Run." "They must have cleared the blockage. It'll take them straight to the inner cave if we don't stop them." Bear turned to Ruby. "You stay here." "I'm going too," she said. "No. You'll need me." Thomas stepped forward. "Let me stay with her." "I'll guard this place with my life." Bear hesitated. Ruby looked from one to the other. Then she nodded. "Okay." Bear and Michael took off running, cutting through the brush. The trail was narrow, nearly swallowed by trees and snow, but the ground showed signs, broken branches, boot prints, gear dragged through mud. They reached the old shaft in minutes. The entrance was blackened with fresh scorch marks. The door had been blasted open. Inside, the air was hot and sharp with the scent of iron. Bear moved quickly, lantern swinging at his side, rifle strapped to his back. They passed familiar marker stones painted with guardian symbols, old bones carved with names, talismans of warning. But now they were cracked, broken, trampled. The tunnel opened into the first chamber, the one with the still lake. Except now it wasn't still. The water shimmered violently, rippling outward in jagged waves. The soft blue light had turned sharper, brighter. The stone beneath their feet pulsed like a heartbeat, trying to outrun its cage. And then, a crack. Not a small one. A thunderous, deep tear that echoed through the walls like a cannon. Bear spun around. A line of white light split the wall behind the lake. The sacred chamber was opening. Unbidden. Michael gasped. They're breaking it open from the other side. They found the seal. We need to stop them. Bear looked down at the map Ruby had drawn in the dirt days ago. The only other entrance to the heart was behind that wall. He stared at it, and the wall cracked again. This time the light didn't just glow, it poured out. A blinding, ancient, shimmer-pale silver, gold, and something else entirely. Not color, not heat, something older than either. Bear shielded his eyes. From somewhere within that growing light he heard a voice. It wasn't English, it wasn't Lakota. It was something that made the blood in his bones sing like iron on an anvil. Michael stumbled back. "What is that?" Bear didn't answer. Because he knew. The mountain wasn't waiting anymore. It had awoken. Family mocked the giant cowboy and his daughter for a cabin until they discovered this secret. The earth shuddered beneath their boots. Bear and Michael scrambled to brace themselves against the wall of the chamber as the fissure behind the lake cracked wider, light spilling out like a sunrise inside the mountain. Rocks trembled loose from the ceiling, dust cascading through beams of white fire. At the lake's edge, Ruby stood alone. Her small frame looked impossibly fragile in the vast glow, but her eyes were steady. She held the carved staff in both hands. Its surface was now pulsing, lit from within. The markings of generations shimmered like hot metal. The water at her feet rippled outward, not from her movement, but from something deeper, a force stirring beneath. Michael gasped. "Do you see them?" Bear followed his gaze. Figures stood in the light, dozens, then hundreds, ghost-like, translucent, but distinct. Men and women from every generation, some in buckskins, some in tattered soldiers' coats, others with painted faces, robes, tools, scrolls, feathers in their braids. Some bore weapons, others carried only open palms. They formed a ring around the lake, around Ruby. "Guardians," Bear whispered. One by one they nodded to her. Behind them, the intruders arrived. Whitmore and a dozen armed men pushed through the opening in the stone. Their faces were covered with cloth, their eyes wide from the unnatural light. They were dressed in mining gear but carried rifles and tools meant for destruction. Greed hung on them like oil. "There! The girl!" Whitmore shouted, pointing his revolver. Ruby didn't move. The chamber began to shake. Not from explosives, from something living. The lake's glow intensified, rising up like steam, then turning solid, a dome of light encasing Ruby and the spirits. When the armed men stepped closer, the earth beneath them shifted. One screamed as the floor opened beneath his boots, swallowing him whole. Another aimed his weapon, but the gun jammed, metal warped by heat that hadn't come from fire. Whitmore staggered forward, fury twisting his face. He raised his gun and took aim at Ruby's heart. "Stop!" Bear bellowed, stepping into his path, rifle raised. Whitmore sneered. "You think this ends with her? This land is a resource, Morrison, and resources belong to those with the power to take them." Ruby lifted the staff. The light exploded outward. It struck Whitmore like a hammer. He stumbled back, dropped his weapon, and fell to his knees. Around him the lake flared in columns of silver flame, and the spirits stepped forward. Their feet never touched the ground. Their voices rose in song, a language Bear didn't know, yet understood. Ruby's eyes were glowing now, not in a frightening way, but like someone seeing clearly for the first time. She stepped onto the water's surface. It held her. "You came to take," she said, voice echoing across stone. "But what lies here cannot be taken, only protected." Whitmore struggled to rise. "You're just a child." Ruby raised the staff again. The light wrapped around it, spun down into the carved grooves, igniting every ancient line. The spirits chanted. The ceiling above pulsed with the same glow. "I'm not just a child," Ruby said. "I am the voice of all who stood before me. I am the last guardian, and the first of a new circle." The chamber erupted in song. Wind filled the cavern without air. Water danced around her. Firelight without flame kissed her skin. The staff rose from her hand, floated mid-air, then descended slowly until it touched the very center of the lake. Where it touched, the surface opened. A pillar of pure energy burst upward, connecting the floor to the sky above, cutting through rock like it wasn't there. A beam of light so strong it could be seen for miles above the mountain. Whitmore stared up, blind now from the radiance. Ruby turned to him. "You think we're protecting dirt?" She stepped closer. The guardians followed. "We're protecting balance. We're protecting memory. We're protecting the world." Behind her, the spirits stood as one. "And you are trespassing." The light pulsed again. Whitmore and his men were thrown backward by a force they couldn't see. The tunnel behind them sealed with a groan of stone, cutting off their escape. The mountain had chosen, and its choice was clear. Family mocked the giant cowboy and his daughter for a cabin until they discovered this secret. The mountain fell still. Where there had been thunder, silence. Where there had been fury, peace. Bear stood near the edge of the lake, its silver glow now calm once more. The staff rested gently at Ruby's feet. She knelt beside it, hand hovering just above, as if not yet ready to let go. Whitmore lay on the stone floor, eyes wide, chest heaving. His men had scattered or been carried out, some by the strength of guardian hands, others by the will of the mountain itself. He made no move to rise. "It doesn't belong to you," Bear said, walking slowly toward him. And it never did. Whitmore's face had lost its sneer. He looked past Bear, past the spirits who still lingered in the chamber, and into the depths of the glowing lake. "You think you've won?" he rasped. "No," Bear said. "I think we remembered what matters." Behind them, the spirits began to fade, not in defeat, but in peace. Their duty passed on. Edmund arrived minutes later, arms raised, hands empty. He wore no hat, no smugness, just shame. Thomas followed at his heels, jaw clenched. Edmund looked at Bear, eyes full of something almost human. "I tried to fight it," he admitted. "Tried to own it. But you were right, Sam. Father was right. This land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it." He reached into his coat and pulled out the deed. Not just to the cabin, but to all the lands around it. Old mining claims, ancestral easements, surveys their family had held for over a century. He handed it to Bear. "You decide what happens next." Bear took it, but he didn't keep it. Weeks passed, and with time the mountain healed. What followed wasn't a retreat, but a rising, not of weapons, but of words. Thomas, Michael, and the descendants of the Guardians worked together to form what they called the Morrison Foundation, an organization that could speak the language of courts and capitals, but whose heart beat in caves and roots. They secured rights to protect sacred spaces across the West, places forgotten by maps but not by memory. Bear didn't want his name on it. But Ruby insisted. "Your name means something now," she told him. "Let it mean protection." So it did. The paperwork was signed under a cedar tree next to the cabin. Government officials came out from Cheyenne, along with historians, tribal elders, and even a few journalists. They witnessed the declaration of land held in trust, not for profit, but for preservation. And when they asked who would serve as steward, Ruby stepped forward. "He will," she said, pointing to Bear, "and so will I." On the final day of that week, Ruby walked once more to the edge of the lake. The chamber was quiet but not empty. The energy was still there, gentle, pulsing, alive. She held the staff, now smaller, reshaped to her height. The spirits had left her a gift, a map, etched in light. When she closed her eyes and touched the surface of the water, it bloomed beneath her fingers. Lines appeared, like veins of fire beneath skin, spreading across what looked like a body but was actually land. The West. And across that glowing map were points of light, not just here in Wyoming, but Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, even far north into Montana. Each light pulsed, each one a heart. She opened her eyes. "They're not the last," she whispered. Bear stood behind her, arms folded, watching her shoulders rise and fall with slow, even breaths. "What do you see?" he asked. She looked up at him, face calm. "Other guardians," she said. She turned to the light. "They're waking up." Family mocked the giant cowboy and his daughter for a cabin until they discovered this secret. 6 months had passed. The land had greened again. Snowmelt had fed the creek, wildflowers now danced where blood had been spilled, and the tall grass whispered secrets to the wind that only Ruby seemed to understand. The cabin was no longer falling in on itself. Its timbers were straight and clean. The stonework had been reinforced, the roof rebuilt, and windows added where once there had only been dark planks. But it was more than a home now. It was the first headquarters of the Guardian Network of America. People had come from all across the western frontier, not just Lakota descendants or frontier families, but people of every shade, age, and story. They came with questions, with memories, with burdens passed down and hopes barely dared to be spoken. And here, in this clearing between the hills, they were building something new from what had nearly been erased. Ruby stood in front of the cabin, dressed in a pale blue dress. The fabric caught the rising sun like sky come to life. In her hands she held the ancestral staff, shorter now, carved anew, but still bearing every ancient symbol passed down from the first guardian to the last. She stood before a circle of people. Bear, Michael, Thomas, Joseph's spirit family, elders from the northern plains, and even the mayor of a nearby township. Edmund had returned too, not to lead, but to serve. A low hum moved through the crowd as Ruby raised the staff and touched it to the soil. She closed her eyes. This ground holds stories. Her voice was small but clear. It remembers footsteps. It remembers battles. It remembers prayers whispered through tears. And today, it remembers hope. A woman to her left, an elder from the Navajo Nation, stepped forward with a pot of burning cedar. The smoke rose in a slow spiral, curling around Ruby's staff. One by one, others came. A feather, a beaded cloth. A chipped tin cup once owned by a guardian who died with no children. A copper pendant. A letter from a freedman who had found refuge in the hills here during the war. They placed their tokens at Ruby's feet. She knelt and gathered them into a cloth, wrapped them carefully, and placed them in a hollowed-out stone by the front door of the cabin. "May this house hold them all," she whispered. Bear stood at the edge of the circle, watching her. 6 months ago, she was a girl clinging to a threadbare doll. Now she stood as a leader, as the first guardian of a new era. She looked toward him. He walked to her side and placed a hand on her shoulder. "My daughter," he said quietly, The true guardian, now leading the very people who once mocked us. She smiled, leaning into his side. They didn't know, she said. He nodded. They do now. The sun crested the ridge. Light poured over the roof of the cabin and bathed the clearing in gold. Children ran laughing through the tall grass. A young couple placed their hands together and traced the edge of the old carved stone that had once sealed the mountain. Voices sang in 3 languages. At the center of it all, the cabin, and at the cabin's heart, a family, not bound by blood, but by something stronger, by duty, by memory, by love. Inside, the old clock Bear had carried from Philadelphia ticked gently. Nearby, a faded quilt lay across a wooden bench, stitched with symbols now understood. The wind lifted through the open windows. Ruby lifted her face to it. She could still feel them, the other lights, the ones scattered across the land, flickering beneath mountains and deserts and rivers. Waiting. "Do you think we'll find them?" she asked. Bear looked at the horizon. "No," he said. "I think they'll find us." And somewhere far away, deep beneath red rock or black forest, another child stirred in their sleep. A staff, yet untouched, pulsed with light. A new voice was waking, and the story was just beginning. If this story of love, legacy, and redemption touched your heart, subscribe to Western Legacy for more tales where the soul of the frontier still rides tall. The guardians are rising, and you won't want to miss what comes next.